into those categories.
Whatever you can find, please share with us. We'll take what we can get for now as we keep moving towards progress. Thank you all, panelists. We're going to move to the second panel on CalWORKs. Thank you all. We're going to invite Mr. Lightbourne to stay and have the other panelists join him. Mike Harold, advocate from the Western Center on Law and Poverty. Frank Mecca, Executive Director of the County Welfare Directors Association of California. Kevin Eslanian, Advocate, Coalition of California Welfare Rights Organization, and Ms. Woolsey, sorry if you would also join us too. Thank you. And Chris Cook from Finance.
Okay. Carl, does the sergeant have a handout? Great.
Okay. Apologize in a brief moment. I'm going to have to step out just briefly, and I appreciate my colleague, Mr. Bonta, will be chairing as I step away. But let's do this briefly, and we look forward to question and answers. Mr. Lightbourne.
Thank you. I made the substance of my remarks in the last session. The one thing I perhaps say is in response to the question about sort of just a guaranteed credit. I think it was Nixon who actually proposed a guaranteed annual income.
Don't associate with me. No.
Right.
I'm just saying, let's make it easier.
Right. But the one thing that as we look at strategies, et cetera, I just want us to make a note of is let's be careful that we not adopt any that we're sensitive to needs for people to have valid Social Security numbers in order to access a benefit.
That makes sense. Thank you.
It's just a sensitivity.
Good afternoon. I'm Todd Bland. I'm Deputy Director at the Welfare to Work Division at the California Department of Social Services. I will be speaking from a handout that I think you have. I'm not going to go through all of it. I understand time is short, but I will try to hit some highlights from it. If you turn into the first page, is actually a couple pages in, there's just a very brief CalWORKs overview, and all I'm going to say is that CalWORKs is our version of the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, and our program provides benefits to families and children and maintains those benefits for children even when the parents time out or if they have problems with the program through sanctioning. And I think that commitment to children has always been a core value of the CalWORKs program, and over 1 million of the program's recipients are children. And I would add that when you look at the national data on in terms of the number of children in poverty, again on the older measure, not the more revised measure, approximately half of the children that are in poverty in California by that measure are being served in our CalWORKs program, whereas the national numbers are as low as 18%. Those are data from 2013. In the spirit of time, I'll move off of that background page. On the next page, we have a table at the top about the budget. I think your committee agenda, which is prepared by your staff, does an excellent job setting up the budget. I won't take time with that, but always happy to take questions at any time or at the end of the conversation. But I would take a moment on the table on that page to just show the diversity of the CalWORKs caseload, and we really have multiple kinds of cases. We have cases where there is an aided adult, and those adults are usually expected to participate in the welfare to work services, potentially to remove barriers, obtain education, obtain on-the-job training, obtain employment, and potentially become self-sufficient. Some are not able to, and they may be exempt for various reasons why they cannot participate. And if they cannot, they may, but if they are required to participate and cannot, they may end up sanctioned. But as I mentioned earlier, in California, we have a commitment to the children. Even when we sanction, we do not have a full family sanction. We only sanction the adult. Nonetheless, that's a significant impact on those families. Don't mean to understate that. In the next group of cases, we have a lot of child-only cases where essentially there is no aided adult. It could be because the parents are undocumented. It could be non-needy caretaker relatives or perhaps the parents on SSI. There's a note there about drug felons. That's about to change. Previously, under prior law, drug felons were ineligible for the benefits. However, on April 1, they will be eligible, so they would move to the top half of the table when we present this to you a year from now. And as I mentioned before, California is committed to a safety net, and essentially those essentially become child-only cases because the adult is removed. That's a brief background on the breakdown of the caseload. I'm really going to skip the next table, which is just some background on grant levels and the maximum amount of food allotment that's available and caseload. It's some historical information the committee has been interested in, so we provide it for your reference. But I don't think I'm going to walk through that. I think some of your other witnesses are also going to be talking about grants and their adequacy and their opinions on that. What I will spend a little bit more time on is the next page on the Welfare to Work 24-month time clock. This was a key feature of the SB 1041 legislation enacted in 2012. Essentially, it created a flexible time when essentially, sort of without respect to federal rules, which essentially often limit barrier removal or education. Education is limited to 1 year under federal, and other barrier removal activities such as mental health or substance abuse are limited and measured in weeks, not months or years. We essentially wanted to create a very flexible 24-month time where essentially any type of activity, whatever would help the family, they could do that, and they could do that for 24 months. And if they were in education, it really would be 36 months because 1 year is federally countable. At the end of that 24-month period, then the federal requirements kick in. Some people believe the federal requirements are really about work, and I would say they're much more work-related than the more general CalWORKs, but they do include things besides a job. It could be subsidized employment, could be on-the-job training, could be work-study, could be community work experience. The way we crafted the 24-month time clock, we recognized, I think from the beginning, that not all families would be able, not all adults would be able to sort of finish educational goals, or perhaps they were trying to seek entry into another program such as SSI. We knew that might not time out at 24 months. So we have extensions available of up to 6 months and potentially renewable. And there's a target that those would be granted to approximately 20% of the caseload. Kind of skipping to the bottom, and some of your other witnesses are going to be talking later today about sort of, well, what happened under the 24-month clock? Why didn't people take advantage of education? What was going on? We don't know all the answers, but I think you have two countervailing forces going on. On the one hand, you had the flexibility of the 24-month time clock, which might have indeed encouraged people into educational and barrier removal activities. On the other hand, we actually had a slowly but surely recovering economy. And the most recent data we have indicates that the share of CalWORKs families with earnings rose from 24% at the beginning of this period to, in the third quarter, all the way to 30.9%. And moreover, their earnings increased from just under $2,300 to $2,800 in a quarter. And that is the highest in a decade, and it's higher than the pre-recession level. I'm speaking, of course, in nominal terms, not inflation-adjusted terms. Education, as some of your other witnesses will indicate, we didn't have increases in that, and in fact we had reductions in the self-initiated programs. That's the ability of clients to actually, if they already were engaged in education the moment they walked in our door, they could stay with that program, and that's still available to them. But under the more flexible 24-month clock, many chose not to go that route. They chose to do education through the 24-month clock, and that's more generous with respect to how we treat study time and how they can count those hours. Finally, I'll close with a note on sanctions on this point. Indeed, sanctions have gone up during this time period. That's not a big surprise in that two things were going on. On the one hand, we were re-engaging. Prior to this time period, we had a young child exemption. We expanded the number of exemptions from participation during the very difficult, terrible recessionary budget times when I sat at a different part of this table and helped comment and craft ideas then. We reduced funding for the single allocation, and with that we said, well, if the counties aren't going to have the funding to help everyone, we have to reduce who's required to participate. But we were able to put the money back and serve everybody, and part of the program was a required in-depth conversation with every member of the caseload about the new program and what's available. So indeed, sanctions would go up. What I would add is that it appears they may have peaked in August of 14 and have fallen some since then. I don't think I'll go into detail on the next page on the flow chart, but would be happy to take questions on it. Essentially, this is a chart we have prepared before. It's our first estimate of how many families. It's not our first, it's really our second estimate. A year ago, we estimated it using data that was from our 48-month clock, but now we finally have 24-month clock data, and the numbers are suggestive of a much lower impact. I'll sort of cut to the chase. Our current projection is that by June of 1560, we would be at 2,600 cases potentially facing a grant reduction, with an average monthly for the whole year of 1,000. Again, happy to take questions on that later. What the agenda did ask me to specifically comment on, and that's where I'll try to take I got two more things I got to do besides that, was to talk about the status of the things that were enacted the next year. After we did the 24-month, after the SB 1041 changes, the legislature, in partnership with the administration, came up with three important new elements: expanded subsidized employment, the online CalWORKS assessment tool, and the family stabilization program. I'll talk about subsidized employment first on page 6. There are some highlights from the program. In the spirit of time, I'll just note towards the bottom, 42 counties have reported participation in subsidized employment as of February. County plans indicate over 8,000 jobs will be created in 14-15, and those placements are in a range of places. On April 1, there is a deadline for a legislative report with more information on subsidized employment. So I would, we are gathering that information. We'll be able to give you more information in April. Turning to the next page, the Family Stabilization Program, another key component of the changes we did in the second year in AB 74. I think we recognize that CalWORKS is a welfare to work program, but not everybody is ready to benefit from that when they come in the door, even if they're able-bodied. They might be in crisis. They might need mental health or substance abuse or other barrier removal activity. They may need housing. So we recognize that, and the Family Stabilization Program allows intensive case management for such cases. We're just beginning to get the reports, and I think county reporting, and I don't want to get down on the counties. They have a lot to do, and we'll talk about that as well. But based on the reports that they are filing from this fall and summer, 610 cases were receiving family stabilization in July. That's what's reported, and that has doubled to over 1,300 in December. The trend is going in the right direction. Again, in the spirit of time, I'll move on to the online CalWORKS appraisal tool on the next page. Here's a place where I think we were too ambitious. We had hoped that this might have been up in calendar 14, and it's not yet. But in the spirit of getting it right, rather than getting it done on time, I think we've done it the right way. We've worked extensively with the counties, with stakeholders, with even some of the legislative staff. Actually, we're able to sit in on the pilot phase of this and actually see how the tool works. Although counties always had appraisal systems, we're now going to have a statewide tool. It was originally created by the federal government. It is a validated tool, and all we've been working on is the customization. What your agenda asks is, well, what is the status of that? Up in the box on the right, you have some key dates that we will be training in April through June, and approximately 90 days after a county gets trained, we would think they would be able to bring it up throughout their county. So I would say most likely it will be up completely statewide. Add 3 months to July, probably September of 2015. Again, this is not as fast as we would have hoped, but I think the process we've had is a good one. I think we're really going to get a good tool when we're done with it. The last thing I'll talk about is the subject of work participation rates. I do this because the state faces potential substantial fiscal penalties for this. WPR, or work participation, is not the best measure of program success. It's a measure of what the clients are doing. It's not a measure of how they're progressing. That said, it is a measure that the federal government thinks is very important and will sanction states over. I won't go into the details of the table, but the half-full, half-empty table I've got here for you is that we're not quite there yet. 50% is the magic number. We need to reach 50% to essentially avoid $341 million in penalties. And we're not quite there yet. We have launched the Work Incentive Nutritional Supplement Program, and that was not an easy task. That provides a $10 food benefit to CalFresh families who are working enough to meet federal, but we need to document that. We've been working with our counties, and it's been a great improvement, and but we're still not quite there. In the bottom of the chart, we show some additional things that we're going to be doing, but we're just not quite there. With those things, we think we'll get over the hump, but I just want to point out meeting WPR is something our counties need to work on, and it's there along with all the other things we've been talking about that we've been implementing, the family stabilization, the OCAP, the subsidized employment. I think we can ignore the next page. It just talks about the amount of the penalties. I won't go into the wins. I will close on page 12 with just a few notes about accountability. We have contracted with the RAND Corporation to conduct an evaluation of SB 1041. The statutory deadline for that is January of 18, and we will meet that deadline. And we will be getting information from RAND before 18, and we expect to share that with you. At this point, they are just getting started. They are in the data gathering phase, in fact, arranging data sharing arrangements with our 3-county consortia. So at this point, they're really only talking to us about process. They're not talking to us about results. But as that happens, we will be able to share. And pursuant to the supplemental report language adopted by the legislature last year, we are hoping to provide our first CalWORKS program summary in April. It will be, the document may not be as complete in this first iteration in April as it will be in future years, but we've already had one stakeholder meeting where we talked about what types of information should be in that and how to synthesize that. That was an effective meeting. In the interest of time, I will stop.
Thank you, Mr. Bland. I'm going to turn the gavel over to Assemblymember Bonta, who'll take us from here. I'm going to ask that you all, I'm hopeful that he'll be in good hands with all of you while I'm gone. And I'm going to ask if the presenters would keep your comments to about 5 minutes each so that we can make sure we get in all the panels and the public. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bonta.
I'll hit you back. All right. I promise not to do anything crazy with this. So let's go to Mr. Harold next.
Yes. Thank you, Assembly Member. I'm Mike Harold with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today before the committee. Let's see. I think Mr. Bland's presentation, he left out about half of his materials, and I think it just underscores how much work has been going on in the last 2.5 years to try to implement SB 1041. And we've spent an awful lot of time with the department in a whole bunch of work group meetings, so have the counties. There's a bunch of DSS staff behind here. We've also spent a lot of time working on this. It was an extraordinarily complex effort, and I know Mr. Mecca will go into that more. But when I heard Mr. Bland testify here today, I was just kind of getting exhausted, just thinking back on everything that we had done and all the work that had gone on. My comment to Frank was, oh, I forgot about WINS. We did that too. It was like there's just been so much that has changed in the CalWORKS program in recent years, and we have a slightly different view than the department on this, but and I'll get to that in a moment. First, though, I want to go back to the very first person that you heard from this morning or this afternoon in the hearing, and that was Director Lightbourne. And he said something that was extremely important, and I really want to underscore this. It was actually going to be my very first point today, which is that the most important thing that we need to focus on in this discussion, and I'm so glad there's a robust discussion around poverty in the capital, but the most important thing that we must focus on is eliminating deep poverty. We have to eliminate deep poverty for every child in this state. And that has to be the first goal and objective that we shoot for. There was other folks who testified about all of the impacts that we now know. The science is very clear on this. We've had multiple hearings on the toxic stress issues in the Capitol in the last couple of years. But here's the takeaway that I think sometimes get lost. We do know how to fix this. It's more money. We have research that shows if we invest $3,000 more into those children's lives when they're very young, we can reverse those negative outcomes that you heard described earlier. And I just think we need to focus on that very closely. One other issue, and I'll move on to CalWORKS after I say this, which is sometimes I think in this discussion about how to reduce poverty, we do have a tendency to focus on the general fund impacts. How much can the state afford? We're not completely robust at the state economy with the state budget yet. But then there's also the countervailing argument, which is that there's new research that's coming out that is suggesting that we can reduce income inequality by actually investing in reducing income inequality. We can increase gross domestic product. In fact, there was a recent report that it's in my letter that says we could have increased GDP by 7% if we had taken measures in 1990 to reduce income inequality back then. So increasing investment actually boosts the economy. And I want to encourage legislators to think creatively and long-term about making the kind of investments that will pay off decades down the road for our children and for our state. And now quickly to CalWORKs. Yes, we have gone through an awful lot of changes. Mr. Bland talked about the changes beginning in SB 1041. Those changes actually really began much earlier than that, going back to 2006, 2007. Previous administrations have been proposing a number of changes, and we've been sort of all over the map in the last 6 or 8 years about what the CalWORKs program is supposed to be doing and who it should be serving. I think this has served the clients very poorly. I think it's made the goals of the program very unclear to almost everyone who's associated with it. And we have taken a program that is probably the most important and useful anti-poverty tool that the state has ever developed and made it far more complicated and less helpful going forward. And I think for us, it's really important that we begin to take a look at what was done in the last 3 years and whether, in fact, it's helping to reduce poverty with our families. Most significantly, as was mentioned, the sanction rate has gone up. Sanction rate has gone up from around 15 to 17%, that's where it was traditionally at, to 24.3% today. 1 out of every 4 recipients is now being sanctioned in the state of California. That has the effect of driving families into even deeper poverty. This legislature in recent years has been taking steps to try to eliminate policies that drive families into deep poverty, and we have been a major advocate for eliminating the maximum family grant program, which we're hoping will get accomplished in this year's budget. But as long as the sanction rate stays at that very high level, we are driving even more families into very deep poverty that we simply must address and take a look at. So these kind of outcomes that we're seeing from SB 1041 are very troubling. We also would encourage the legislature to take a very strong look to make sure that families who are transitioned into the TANF 24-month clock are not suffering high levels of sanction rates also. The department, I think, does have some early estimates about what that might look like in 2015 and 16. And again, it looks like there's going to be a very high sanction rate of the folks who don't get an exemption or who don't get an extension of their 24-month time clocks. So these are the kind of issues that promote and actually deepen the poverty of the families in the program. And we think the legislature really has to have a focus on reversing those kind of things and making sure that we take steps before more poverty, deep poverty occurs with these families. A couple of other things I would say is there are some good things about SB 1041. There are increased opportunities for people to get into educational activities. We have less hours of participation for families who have children under 6. We're now adopting the federal rule where you only have to work 20 hours a week. These should have had the results of encouraging more families to be able to get into educational activities and the effect, in our mind, of reducing the number of sanctions. As I mentioned before, sadly, we've seen sanctions go up or not reverse as we might have expected. But we're also not seeing educational opportunities increase for CalWORKs families. In fact, we've seen a decrease in the number of people in vocational education, and as some folks in the community colleges will tell you shortly, we're seeing less people being referred to community colleges for participation from the CalWORKs program. So, again, we think that the complicated nature of SB 1041 and the lengthy implementation period that it took for both the state, the counties, folks on the ground to get their hands around this and figure it out are really what's driving these numbers. And perhaps in the future, as we go forward, we can fix these problems and reverse them. But here's the problem. Our clients' time clocks were running, the 24-month clocks were running while we learned how to implement this program properly. And to the degree to which those families were harmed or weren't provided adequate opportunity to participate, and where we're seeing that reflected in high sanction rates, we think the legislature this year needs to take a very close look at ensuring that those families get the opportunity that they were promised back in 2012. And if we have to do some things to extend time clocks for people, or we have to do increase the number of extensions that we give for families, we think that that is fair and just. And we think in the long run it will benefit the state of California by reducing poverty in these families and allowing those children in particular to escape the deep poverty they live in right now. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and we look forward to working with the committee.
Thank you. Before we go over to our next speaker, I just want to recognize and appreciate the presence of our fearless Budget Committee Chair, Dr. Weber. And let's go to Mr. Mecca.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Assemblyman Bonta, and Chair Weber. I'm Frank Mecca, the Executive Director of the County Welfare Directors Association. Appreciate the opportunity to give you the high-level observations of the state of the CalWORKS program from the standpoint of the people administering on your behalf. I'm going to focus on the conclusions that we've come to. I'll go a little light on the analysis in the interest of time and be available for questions. Our first observation is that child poverty is a massive public health problem. The cost to kids and our economy are staggering. The fact that we have the highest child poverty rate in the nation is unacceptable, and it should be policymakers' number one priority as a problem to solve. Secondly, the CalWORKS program as it was originally conceived, we believe was actually well conceived to meet the twin goals of reducing poverty and moving people from welfare to work. That program that was created on a bipartisan basis had grant levels that were about 80% of the poverty level. Certainly not enough, but twice the generosity that they are now. We had reasonable time limits. We had real work requirements. We had ample work supports and incentives for people to work, and we preserved a safety net for children. Our third observation, despite its success, CalWORKS has been the target of constant, relentless, sometimes internally contradictory change, deep cuts to services and grants, and a diminution of work incentives, and the inevitable lessening of work requirements due to those cuts. And I very quickly would just like to refer you to a handout that I believe the sergeants have passed out. Did you hand that one? Yeah. It shows you that for the last decade and a half, there's been almost annual massive change in this program. It's a program where it was always sort of curious that despite its success, objective success, it's been in the crosshairs. Sometimes because of budget cuts and, frankly, the priority of poor families overall. Sometimes the result of ideological, often partisan battles. But from the front line, the people who are administering the program, it's been a program where the amount of change that's implemented, significant change, sometimes flip-flopping change that we've been asked to implement on an annual basis has made this program incredibly challenging to implement, despite our pride in, at least in its original conception, how effective it's been. As I think it was Secretary Dooley said at the outset, she acknowledged billions of dollars of cuts to this program, a reduction in the time limit, decreased in the earned income disregard, elimination of the cost of living adjustment, and a reduction in CalWORKS grants, all of which have done serious damage to the capacity and the culture of the program. So fast forward to a couple of years ago, and you've heard other witnesses talk about sort of a mixed bag of changes to the CalWORKS program. On the one hand, my members are very concerned about the 24-month time limit. We didn't support it. We were fearful that in its implementation it would not leave enough families with sufficient time. And we will monitor the impact of the implementation of that time limit and make sure that those impacts are brought to you and to the state. On the other hand, the year later, we did some really good things that have the potential to be really transformative of the CalWORKs program. The robust appraisal tool, the subsidized employment, the stabilization program, last year's creation of the housing support program. When woven together, these changes really do give us an opportunity to not just look at a client, assess how quickly we can get them to work, maybe redress some of their work barriers and get them into the workforce, but to really address underlying family issues and provide services to address those issues, to provide for more sustainable long-term self-sufficiency. So the potential is there. The difficulty right now is that rebuilding our service capacity and reinvigorating the culture of a program that was damaged by so many years of deep cuts takes time. And some of the numbers that Mr. Bland went over that showed low take-up of services, but a trajectory going in the right direction, really is the function of the fact that we implemented these changes, some of them are yet to be implemented, and we layered them on a program that's capacity was decimated. So we're in rebuilding mode. Our partners are also in rebuilding mode. The community-based agencies and community colleges and others that we rely on to deliver supports are also emerging from the same recession, and their capacity is diminished. So we believe the right elements are in place, but we're here to tell you unapologetically that this is going to take time to weave all those components together so that your vision of a really changed program where the front end offers the opportunity for people to have more flexibility to address a better assessed sense of their family dynamics is going to take time to implement. So our recommendations, jumping to the end. Let me tell you the problems that we continue to see. Grants are too low. Children are suffering, but their parents suffer from those low grants too. What my members are telling me is when families are struggling basically to make ends meet, to make a rent payment, to avoid homelessness, it's impossible for them to focus on their welfare to work preparation. So we should think about grants as a welfare to work strategy, not just a child anti-poverty strategy. And at 40% of the federal poverty level, they're simply inadequate. The maximum family grant exclusionary rule just plunges children into deep poverty. No more needs to be said. And the housing costs in California are making it extremely difficult for people on this program to avoid housing instability and homelessness. Our recommendations: repeal the maximum family grant. We're co-sponsoring legislation once again to do so. We have to do something about the grant levels in this program. They're simply not adequate. Continue to support the changes that are underway. Give us some time and give us some support because we really think that with our partnership with the state, we can weave them into a better program. We think you should expand the housing support program, the CalWORKs Housing Support Program. We're so appreciative to the Speaker and to the members of the legislature and to the administration for creating a really innovative program where the world of social services and the housing world are coming together to try to address homelessness and housing instability among CalWORKs families. That's a huge barrier to moving people from welfare to work. We've partnered very well with the department. They've done a fantastic job on this. We've partnered well with Housing California and people who represent nonprofits who do affordable housing work to break down silos and bring our systems together. 20 counties were able to participate the first time around with the $20 million that you provided. We're co-sponsoring with Housing California an augmentation in that program of an additional $30 million to allow the rest of the counties to come in and start serving families. I've been asked to say on behalf of John Bowders, the Policy Director at Housing California, to give his plug for that augmentation. He's with the Speaker, who today announced her housing package in Southern California, so he couldn't be here. Finally, we're big supporters of the EITC, and I won't say that we're strongly supporting AB 43 because I understand we're not supposed to do that at this hearing. And then finally, I'd like to say that I think we need to find ways to connect with and work with Mr. Lightbourne and his work to work with the governor's workforce development initiative, because we need employers. And breaking down those silos and bringing those employment prospects to our clients will very much help as well. And we appreciate Mr. Lightbourne's leadership in that regard.